All right, average versus normal. Do these terms mean the same thing? When I mention average here, I'm not referring to the mathematical principle where you have a data set that contains some number of variables and you add up all of those variables and then you divide that sum by the number of variables in the data set. Instead, what I mean by average here is typical. What's typical? So you can think about it as it relates to this chart here, which illustrates the height of 100 American men. And in that data set of 100 American men, you can see what's identified as the average height is in this 5'8", 5'9" range. That's because that's where within this group, most people tended to converge. This is what was typical for the group, to be around 5'8", 5'9". And let's just assume that this group of 100 men is representative of American men in general and their heights. And so we would say that, well, the typical height, the average height for American men is somewhere in this 5'8", 5'9" range. Does that mean that 5'8" or 5'9" is the normal height for an American man? Does that mean that someone like me who's out here at the 6-foot range is abnormally tall? And we say like, well, no, 6 foot is a perfectly normal height in America for men. And similarly, 5'6" is a perfectly normal height for American men. So there's this range of what's normal that extends beyond the average. We wouldn't start saying that somebody is abnormally tall until we get into like the 6'8", the 7-foot range. And then we're going to say like, wow, not only are you outside of the average, you're also outside of what's normal for a human male. Okay, now so what the takeaway here is that what's average may include what's normal, and what's normal may be average, but not necessarily. It may be the case that sometimes what's typical is not normal, and sometimes what's normal is not what's typical. And you can see that reflected here in this graph that tracks average weight of 40 to 49-year-olds, males and females, from 1960 to 2010. And you can see here that the average weight is going up. In other words, the typical weight is increasing over time. And what we know is that the Americans have been getting larger, right? You watch the news and you see all of these studies on American obesity, and we can see that what's become typical for American human beings is not necessarily what's normal for human beings. And you can see that kind of reflected here in this chart, where we have this range represented by this white area that correlates to the X and Y axis for for weights and height. What is a normal weight for somebody of a particular height? And that's what this white area of the graph indicates. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the average American falls within this. In fact, it's probably likely the case that, at least based on what I understand, most Americans fall up here in the red area, which would be typical but not normal. So I think about this as it relates to human health, because that's where it's really going to be of concern to us. We have this range of, these metrics that we use to measure a person's health. And there's a range that we say is normal. So you think about temperature, for example. We think like, well, 98.6 is the normal temperature for a human being. And it's like, well, there's a range there. You could be the case that you run cold like me. Whenever I check my body temperature, I'm somewhere in that 97 range. But other people are going to run a little hotter, and they're going to be up in the 99 range. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're abnormal. Or blood pressure, there's a range. Or blood glucose, there's a range. Probably somewhere between 80 and 120 is a normal range for blood glucose levels, even though that might not be the average. Okay, so the question for us is this. Can we define what's normal in terms of health for human beings? Okay, can we define that range, this sort of adequate baseline, this range of health for that's normal, but even though it might not be typical for human beings?